She was 30 years old and a widow when she answered a phone call from a 605 area code she did not recognize on a Thursday afternoon in late March, sitting in the break room of a title insurance office in Rapid City, South Dakota, eating a sandwich she did not want. The man on the other end of the line said his name was Orville Tasher, county clerk of Jones County. He said a property had come to her through her mother's side and that there were back fees and that she would need to drive out to Murdo to deal with it in person. He was sorry to bother her. He had read about her husband in the paper a year and a half ago, and he was sorry for that too. She had $310 in her checking account that mattered, and a duffel bag of clothes that had all been bought for a different life. By the end of that week, for $1 and the back fees nobody else would touch, she would own a 68-foot wooden grain elevator on the section line 3 miles north of Murdo, with a tax clearance deadline at the end of the month and a winter already in the mail. But what nobody knew was that inside its office safe, a Mosler 1937 with a combination her great-grandfather had set and never changed, was a leather ledger that would change everything she thought she understood about being left behind. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We like seeing how far these stories travel. Sloane Merrick had been moving toward the open country her whole life and had spent most of it moving the other way. She was born in Rapid City, on the wet edge of the Black Hills, where the prairie ran out against the pines. But her mother's people were West River people, flat country people, Reisigs out of Jones County, and every summer until Sloane was 15, her mother had driven her 3 hours east on Interstate 90 to Murdo to spend 2 weeks with relatives whose names she could no longer fully reconstruct. She remembered the drive better than the people. She remembered the way the hills fell away behind the car and the land opened and kept opening until the only vertical things left in the world were the fence posts and the power poles, and every 8 or 10 miles, a grain elevator standing against the sky like the last building of a town that had decided not to bother with the rest of the town. She used to count them. Her mother told her once that the Reisigs had owned one. She had not believed it, the way a child does not believe that her own dull relatives could have owned anything worth standing that tall. What she remembered of those summers, when she made herself remember them, was small and physical and had nothing to do with people. The smell of a screen door, a galvanized stock tank with a film of pollen on the water, and a windmill turning over it slow and then fast and then slow again as the wind decided. A great-aunt whose name she could not now retrieve, who fried eggs in bacon grease and did not talk and was not unkind, the same not unkindness she would hear other people use about Edmund Reisig before she understood it was a family trait and not a coincidence. Her mother out there had been a different person, looser in the shoulders, slower to check her watch, and Sloane had not understood at 15 that what she was watching was a woman briefly returned to the country that had made her, and that the watch-checking version, the Rapid City version, was the one her mother had built to survive somewhere else. By 16, the summer trips had stopped, the way things stop, because the great-aunt died and the cousins scattered, and there was no longer a house to stay in, and Sloane had been relieved, the way a teenager is relieved, and had not thought about West River again for years. Her mother died when Sloane was 26. Cancer, the slow kind, 18 months of it. By then, Sloane had a job and a small apartment and a boyfriend who would become a husband, and the funeral was held in Rapid City, and the West River relatives did not come because by then there were almost none of them left. She married Theo a year after that. He was a geologist, a quiet, careful man who worked contract survey for the state and for mining companies, and who spent half the year out in the field with a Brunton compass and a field notebook and a truck that always smelled like dust and coffee. He taught her things. He taught her to read a USGS topographic map, to find the contour lines and turn them into a picture of land she had never seen, to understand that a slope and a soil type and 100 years of rainfall could tell you what a place would and would not let you do. He taught her that you could know a place you had never stood in if you were willing to read it carefully. She had liked that. She had liked him. He kept his field notes in a particular way, every observation dated and located and never embellished. And on the nights he was home, he taught her to keep them with him, the two of them at the kitchen table, writing down the day in a language that had no adjectives in it. He died on a survey in eastern Montana when Sloan was 28 and a half. A cut bank gave way above a dry creek where he had gone to check an exposure, alone, the way he often worked when the country was open and the day was good. The report used the word unstable. It was the kind of thing that happened to careful men in unstable country, and it did not care that he was careful. She got the call on a Tuesday. She remembered it was a Tuesday because she had been at work, and her supervisor had walked into the break room with a face she would never forget, holding the phone out to her the way you hold out a thing you wish you did not have to hand to anyone. And after that, the days had no names for a long time. His field notebook came back to her with his other effects, 6 weeks later, in a cardboard box from the state. The last entry was the morning he died, a soil description in his small, flat hand, the texture and the color and the moisture, dated and located, no adjectives, because he had taught her there were no adjectives in the truth about a place. She had read that last entry many times. It did not say goodbye. It was not supposed to. It was a man paying attention to the world on the last morning he was in it, and she had not understood, for a long time, why that was the thing that comforted her instead of the thing that broke her. She understood it later, in the office of an elevator, reading a different book in a different flat hand. But that was later. The year and a half that followed was a thing she did not have good words for. She kept the apartment. She kept the job. She processed title searches and chain of ownership documents and lien releases with the same methodical attention she had once given to Theo's field notes. And at 5 o'clock she went home and ate something standing at the counter and went to bed early because there was nothing else she could think of to do with the hours. People told her she was handling it well. She knew what they meant. They meant she had not made anyone uncomfortable. The truth was that she had stopped, the way she had watched her own mother stop near the end, ember by ember, except that Sloan was 30 and her body kept working, and so she kept going to the office and processing the documents and coming home, and that was the shape of it. Then Orval Tash called. She almost did not answer. She had developed the habit of not answering unknown numbers, the way you develop all the small protections, quietly and without noticing, until the habit is part of you. She answered on the 4th ring. He spoke slowly, the way people speak in places where there is no particular reason to hurry. He explained that her great-grandfather, Edmund Reisig, had owned the Reisig elevator on the section line 3 miles north of Murdo, and that it had passed down through the family in a tangle of small estates and unprobated wills until, by the arithmetic of survival, Sloan was the last living person it could legally land on. There were 31 years of accumulated county fees against it. The county did not particularly want the fees. The county wanted the title cleared because an elevator with no living owner was a liability nobody could insure. And there was a window, he said, a tax clearance window that closed at the end of April, after which the county would have to take it for the back fees and tear it down or let it fall, and either of those cost money the county did not have. She could clear the title for $1 and the assumption of the fees, most of which the county was prepared to forgive if someone took responsibility for the structure. Or she could decline and sign a paper and never think about it again. She asked how tall it was. There was a pause on the line, the pause of a man who had expected almost any other question. 68 feet, he said, from the gravel to the top of the head house. Wooden cribbed walls. Put up before the First War, though the date stenciled over the man-lift door had weathered past reading, and the county register and the local memory disagreed by a year. Her great-grandfather had bought it off the bank in 1947, he said, after the man before him went broke on it in the 30s, and had run it the rest of his life. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said before, and then he said, more quietly, that her great-grandfather had been the kind of man who kept good records, and that there was an office in the base of it, and a safe, and that the safe had never once been opened in all the years he had been clerk, because nobody had ever had the legal standing to open it. She told him she would drive out the next morning. She did not entirely understand why. She told herself it was because of the window, the deadline, the tidy administrative logic of a thing that had to be decided by the end of April. That was the reason she could say out loud. The reason she could not say was that she had spent a year and a half being a person to whom things only happened, and Orval Tasha had just described a thing she could decide. The drive east was long, and she was glad of it. Rapid City fell away, and the hills fell away behind it, and by wall the land had committed itself to being flat, the kind of flat that is not empty but is mostly sky, a sky that filled the windshield and pressed down on the thin strip of brown grass at the bottom of it until the grass seemed like an afterthought the sky was tolerating. It was late March. The grass had not greened. The snow was gone except in the road ditches on the north sides, dirty and granular and shrinking. Somewhere east of the hills, out past Kadoka, where the Badlands let go of the road, she crossed the line she had read about once in a thing Theo left around the apartment. The 100th meridian, the place geographers drew through this part of the country to mark where the rain stops being enough and farming becomes an argument with the sky that the sky usually wins. You cannot see it. There is no sign. But the land knows it is there, and it shows you in the spacing of the towns and the height of the grass, and the way the elevators stand farther and farther apart as you go. He had thought lines like that were beautiful, the places where one truth handed off to another. She had thought he was strange. She missed his strangeness more than almost anything. She passed the elevators. She had forgotten she used to count them. She counted them now, out of an old reflex, the way she counted everything now to keep her mind from going where it went, and somewhere past the Murdo exit, she understood that one of them, when she got to it, was going to be hers, and the understanding sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, not unpleasant, just present, the first new weight she had agreed to carry in a year and a half. Murdo was smaller than she remembered, and exactly where she had left it, a single main street of low brick buildings off the interstate, a cafe, a hardware store, a courthouse with a flag snapping straight out in a wind that came hard and steady out of the northwest. The courthouse was open. It closed at noon on Wednesdays, a hand-lettered card on the door informed her, but this was a Friday, and Orval Tash was at his desk with a thermos and 2 cups, as if he had been sure she would come. He was a big man gone soft with age, 70 or close to it, with hands that had clearly done other work before they had spent 29 years pushing paper across a county desk. He had been clerk of Jones County, he told her, since 1995. He had outlived 2 assessors, a sheriff, and most of the people who remembered why half the county roads were named what they were named. He poured her coffee from the thermos without asking whether she wanted it, which she understood later was the first test and the first kindness, and he watched her drink it, and when she did not flinch at how strong it was, he seemed to decide something. He drove her out himself, north on a gravel section road, the courthouse dropping behind them, and then nothing, just the road and the grass and the fence and the sky. 3 miles. The wind rocked the truck, and then it came up out of the section line ahead of them, the way old elevators do, not so much placed there as grown there, slowly and without asking permission. A 68-foot wooden tower, the color of dried blood, where the 1968 paint had not yet given up, and bare grey board where it had. 2 letters stenciled high on the south face, faded but legible. R.E. for Reisig. Her great-grandfather had painted them up there himself, Orval said, the first summer he owned it, on a section line his own father had homesteaded in sod a lifetime before. He let it go in '89, Orval said. Last grain went out of it in the fall. After that it just stood. He cut the engine and the wind filled the cab. Folks said Edmund Reisig was the only man in Jones County who could weigh a load to the pound by feel before he ever ran it across the scale. I don't know if that's true. People say things about the dead they wouldn't say about the living. He looked at the tower a moment, but he kept the scale calibrated to the day he closed the doors. I know that part's true. I've seen the book. He gave her the key on a plain ring and a sheet of yellow legal paper, torn from a pad, on which was written in his careful hand a combination. 38 right, 21 left, 15 right. He said the combination had come down with the deed, copied from owner to owner, set by Edmund in 1937 when he bought the safe second-hand, and that as far as Orval knew, no living person had ever turned the dial all the way through it. He had the legal standing to, now, as clerk, but he had not. Didn't seem like mine to open, he said. She asked him why he'd kept after it. 31 years of fees, a structure nobody could insure, a dead family. It would have been easier, she said, to let the county take it and pull it down and be done. He was quiet a moment, looking out the milky window of the courthouse at the flag standing straight out in the wind. He said the county had voted 3 times to demolish it, and 3 times he had found a reason it could wait another year. A paperwork reason, a budget reason, a reason that was technically true. He did not say the reason that was actually true, which she came to understand only later. The reason that was actually true was that Orval Tash had clerked that county for 29 years and watched it lose a school, 2 churches, a depot, a hotel, and somewhere over 400 people, and he had decided, privately, without telling anyone, that the Reisig elevator was not going to be one more thing the county let the wind have on his watch if there was any way under heaven to find it a person. He had been waiting, in other words, for her, or for someone like her, without any particular reason to believe she would come. People out here, she would learn, kept faith with things on no evidence at all. It was nearly the first thing about them she came to love. She walked toward it across the dead grass, with the wind pushing at her back. The office was a low addition at the base of the tower, a single room with a plank door and a 4-pane window gone milky with dust. The door key turned hard and then gave. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled of old grain and machine oil and the particular sweet dust that gets into wood and never comes out. A roll-top desk, a swivel chair, the seat cracked. A wall calendar from 1989, the month of October, a feed store advertisement at the top, a heifer in a pen, the dates after the 20th never crossed off, and against the back wall, squat and black and patient, a Mosler safe with the gold lettering nearly rubbed away. She did not open it that day. She told herself it was the light, that it would be dark in an hour, and she did not want to do it by flashlight. That was true, but it was also that her hands were not steady, and she did not want Orval Tash, waiting in the truck, to see them shake. She climbed the ladder instead, the man lift long since dead, up through the cribbed dark of the elevator's interior, where the light came in narrow knife blades, through the gaps in the boards, and the dust hung in them exactly the way her great-grandfather's records would later say it always did. She came out on the catwalk at the top, 68 feet up, in the wind, and she could see the whole country at once. The courthouse flag, the grain trucks on the interstate, the elevators of 3 other towns, tiny on the horizon, north and east and south. And below her, the black square of the safe through the office skylight, waiting with a combination no living person had ever turned all the way through. She slept that first night in the Murdo Motel off the interstate, a low row of rooms with a sign that buzzed, and she lay awake a long time listening to the trucks and to the wind working at the corner of the building, and she did not think about the safe. She thought about the dust in the knife blades of light. She thought about how, on the catwalk, for the length of about a minute, she had not been thinking about Theo, and how the not thinking had felt less like relief than like a door that had been painted shut for a year and a half coming loose in its frame. In the morning she did not open the safe. She told herself she would get to it. But standing in the office in the grey early light, with the calendar of October 1989 on the wall, and the cold coming up through the plank floor into her boots, she understood that she did not yet have the right to it. The safe was the inside of the place. She had not earned the inside. So she did the thing her husband would have done, the thing her great-grandfather had probably done 10,000 mornings, which was to start with what was in front of her and work outward until the place stopped being a stranger. What was in front of her was the scale. It sat in the floor at the front of the office where the driveway came in, a wagon scale, a Fairbanks platform built to take a loaded grain truck whole, and tell its weight to the pound. The platform was a slab of oak planking flush with the concrete, 10 feet by 12, riding on a system of levers in a pit below. The beam stood on a cast iron post against the wall, a graduated bar with a sliding poise, the numbers stamped and then filled with black so they would read in bad light. The whole apparatus was a machine for turning a thing you could not hold, a truckload of wheat, a season, a year of a man's work, into a number you could write in a book and take to the bank. She had not understood, until she stood over it, that the elevator was not a barn. It was a bank. It was the first machine most prairie towns ever had that could measure a man fairly and pay him on the spot, and the man who ran it held the trust of every farmer for 30 miles in the calibration of a single iron bar. The poise would not move. She knelt and worked at it, and it had rusted to the bar, and she went into Murdo to the hardware store for penetrating oil and a wire brush, and that was how she met the second person who mattered. His name was Buddy Plenkers. He was at the hardware store counter when she came in asking for liquid wrench and a scale, and he was 70-something and built like a fence post, and when the man behind the counter said she'd taken the Reisig elevator, Buddy turned and looked at her the way the old look at the young when the young have done something the old did not expect. He had farmed wheat north of the Reisig place for 50 years, he said. He had hauled grain across that scale since he was a boy riding in his father's truck. He knew the beam. He came out the next morning in a pickup older than she was, with a wooden toolbox in the bed, and he did not say much, and he showed her the beam. He showed her the knife edges, the hardened steel pivots the whole platform balanced on, ground to a line finer than a blade, the genius and the weakness of the thing. He showed her how a single grain of grit on a knife edge would throw a load off by 10 pounds, and how Edmund Reisig had pulled and cleaned and stoned those edges every spring before harvest, the way another man might sharpen a scythe. They freed the poise with oil and patience. They lifted the platform sections with a pry bar, one at a time, and went down into the pit with a flashlight and cleaned 40 years of mouse nest and chaff out of the lever system, and Buddy ran a fine stone along each knife edge with a touch she could not have managed, his big hands suddenly delicate, and he said, not looking at her, "He taught me this. Edmund. I was maybe 12. He let me clean the edges while he watched and didn't say nothing till I did it wrong, and then he said it once." She asked what he had said. Buddy thought about it. He said, "A scale that lies a little is worse than a scale that lies a lot, because a man'll catch the big lie and trust the small one." He set the stone down. "I've thought about that my whole life." They worked 3 days on the scale alone. The platform sections were oak, 2 inches thick, dished in the middle from 60 years of loaded trucks, and 2 of them had cracked along the grain and had to come out whole, which meant jacking the corner with a bottle jack against a timber and sliding the broken plank free and cutting a new one from rough oak the lumberyard in Murdo special ordered out of Pierre, planed to thickness, drilled and counterbored for the carriage bolts the way the old ones had been. Buddy did the lever work in the pit because his knees, bad as they were, knew where the connections went, and she did the fetching and the cutting and the holding, and somewhere in the middle of the second day she stopped being a stranger to him, not through anything either of them said, but through the way she handed him a wrench before he asked for it, which is a small thing and is also the only thing. They hung a set of test weights from Buddy's toolbox, certified iron, and ran the beam, and it read true to the half-pound on the first try, and Buddy looked at it a long time, and then he looked at her, and he said the elevator had not weighed an honest load since 1989, and now it could, and she understood that something had been handed across to her that had nothing to do with the deed. She had $2,310. That was the whole of it, the savings and what was left of the small settlement after the year and a half, and she kept the number in her head like a fuel gauge. The motel was $41 a night. By the end of the first week, she had moved out of the motel and into the office, with a cot and a propane heater and a 5-gallon can of water from the courthouse tap, because the motel was bleeding her and because she wanted to wake up inside the thing. 2,310 became 1,900. The tax clearance paper was signed and filed. The title was hers, free of the fees, which Orville had quietly gotten the commission to forgive at their April meeting. The window had closed behind her. There was no going back to a life in which this had not happened, and she found she did not want one. The work went outward from the scale. She patched the office roof where it had let water in over the desk. 2 sheets of galvanized she bought in Murdo and screwed down with neoprene washered screws on a still morning, learning as she went, learning that you start a self-tapping screw with the drill in reverse until it finds its bite so it does not wander, learning it from a 15-second exchange with the man at the hardware counter that saved her an hour and 3 ruined screws, which is how the trade has always been handed down out here, in 15-second exchanges over a counter. She replaced the 2 missing shingles on the headhouse cupola, 68 feet up, tied off to the catwalk rail with a climbing rope, and her heart going hard because the cupola was the lid of the whole structure, and the boards below it had begun to rot where the rain came in, and a wet headhouse rots downward, slow and certain, until one winter the whole top of an elevator simply folds. She learned the building from the inside, the cribbed walls that were its secret. She had assumed, the way anyone assumes, that a thing that tall was framed, studs and sheathing, hollow inside like a house. It was not. The walls were 2x4s and 2x6s laid flat, one course on top of another, spiked together solid all the way up, so that the wall was not a skin over a skeleton, but was itself the skeleton. A wall of solid stacked lumber 68 feet tall. And the bins inside were the same, cribbed up plank on plank, so that 10,000 bushels of wheat could lean its whole tremendous weight against the inside of the wall, and the wall would simply stand, because it was not pretending to be light. There were no studs to fail, because there were no studs. She put her hand flat against the inside of a bin wall in the dark, and felt the cool, dense solidity of 40,000 board feet of lumber laid up by men with hammers in the years before the First World War. And she thought, the way Theo would have thought, that it was an honest way to build, that it carried its load without hiding how, and she understood why a man like Edmund Reisig could have spent his life inside it and called it faithful. Almost nobody builds them this way anymore. It costs too much lumber and too much labor, and the grain moves through metal bins now, welded steel, fast and cheap and 100 years younger. The men who knew how to crib a wall 68 feet into the wind are nearly all in the ground, and the walls they laid up are coming down a few each year, and when they go, they take the knowledge with them, because you cannot read it in a book. You can only read it with your hand against the inside of a bin. And the town came, the way prairie towns come, one at a time, with practical things in their hands. Veda came first. She had run the cafe in Murdo for 30 years before her knees made her sell it, and she drove out with a jar of choke cherry jelly, the colour of garnet, and the information that the office's stovepipe drew badly when the wind was in the north and would gas her in her sleep if she didn't crack the window, which was true and which Sloane had already half discovered, having woken one night with a headache and a taste of metal and the good sense drilled into her by Theo's stories of bad campsites to open the door and stand in the cold until her head cleared. Veda stayed an hour. She had known Edmund. Hard man to know, she said. Not unkind, just closed. Came to town Wednesdays to bank and Sundays for nothing at all, far as anybody could tell. She looked around the office, at the cot and the heater and the calendar from October of '89. He'd have liked that you kept the calendar up. He was that way about things. Didn't throw nothing out that had a date on it. She also said, on her way out the door, with the flat practicality these people used for the things that could kill you, that the radio was calling for weather at the end of the week, a late one, a spring blizzard coming down out of Alberta, and that an April blizzard on the West River table was nothing to be casual about, that it came in sideways and dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an hour and could pile snow against the north side of a building taller than a person, and that Sloane had better get the cupola buttoned up and her propane topped off and her truck pointed out toward the road before Thursday, or she'd be in that office alone for 3 days with no help coming, because nobody would be able to get to her and she would not be able to get to anybody. Then she patted the doorframe, the way you pat the flank of a horse you respect, and drove off, and Sloane stood looking at the sky, which was doing nothing, which was bright and high and innocent, and she got the cupola buttoned up by Wednesday night. The blizzard came Thursday afternoon, exactly as Vader had said it would. The temperature falling off a cliff, the wind hauling around to the north, and coming so hard and so full of snow that the courthouse 3 miles away might as well have been on the moon. She spent 3 days inside the elevator office with the propane heater and the choke cherry jelly and a battery radio, and the building did not so much as creak. 68 feet of cribbed lumber standing into a wind that would have peeled a modern house. And she lay on the cot at night and listened to the storm not winning, and understood that her great-grandfather had lain in this same room and listened to this same building not lose this same argument with the sky, year after year, and that this was a thing she now shared with a dead man, and that it was, strangely, the least lonely she had felt since the Tuesday in the break room. Petra came from the county library, a woman near Sloane's own age who had heard the way everyone had heard, and who brought a box of microfilm and a question. The library had the Murdo Coyote, the county paper, on film back to 1906, and the Reisig name was all through it, she said. And would Sloane want to see it? She would. She drove in on a Wednesday afternoon with the courthouse closed and the town quiet, and sat at the library's microfilm reader, scrolling through brittle decades of a county talking to itself, the grain prices, the rainfall, the funerals, until the Reisig name came up, and there he was, E.R. Reisig, in a column of 1936 that was not about heroism at all. It was about grasshoppers. That was the thing nobody told you about the Dust Bowl out here, Petra said, reading over her shoulder. People thought it was all black blizzards, the photographs everyone had seen, the wall of dust over the Oklahoma towns. But West River, South Dakota, in the worst of it, had been killed less by the dust than by the grasshoppers, clouds of them, in 33 and 34, and on through 39, that came down and ate the wheat to the ground, and then ate the fence posts where the men had leaned their hoes, and ate the wooden handles off the hoes themselves. The elevator in those years had stood nearly empty, not because of the wind, but because there was nothing to put in it. And the column from 1936 recorded, in the flat language of a county extension note, that E.R. Reisig had carried 11 farmers' grain debts on the elevator's own books through that summer, rather than call them, so that 11 families had seed in the spring of 37 who would otherwise have had none. It did not call him generous, it just recorded the 11. I have sat at that microfilm reader myself. The county clerk's daughter set it up for me and showed me how the focus knob sticks. The column is real, the ink is grey and the type is broken on the lowercase e, and the number is 11, and I have not been able to find the names because the column did not print the names, and that is its own kind of fact about the man. The column ran in the spring of 1937, I should say, not the summer of 36. I had it wrong in my own notes for a year, and Petra caught it. The carry was made through 36 and reported the following spring, after the seed went in. The distinction mattered to her, and it mattered to me, because the difference between a thing done and a thing reported is the difference between a man and his reputation, and Edmund Reisig kept the two further apart than most. It was Pelham who told her about Marta. He was the oldest of them, 80 if he was a day, a wheat farmer from the next section over who had known Edmund Reisig not as a legend but as a neighbour, which is a different and harder thing to be. He did not come with a gift. He came on a Sunday afternoon and stood at the open office door with his hat in his hand and said he'd heard a Reisig was back on the place and he wanted to see if it was true. She made him coffee on the propane ring. He sat in the cracked swivel chair because she made him take it, and he looked at the safe in the corner, still shut, and he was quiet for a while. "You know about his wife," he said. It was not a question, but she shook her head, and he nodded as if that was about what he'd expected from a great-granddaughter 3 generations and 150 miles removed. Marta Reisig had died in the winter of 1952. Pneumonia, he thought, or something that started as pneumonia. The doctor was in Murdo, and the roads were bad, and by the time they got her in, it was too late. The way it was too late for a lot of people out here before the roads were what they are now. They had been married 9 years. There were no children that lived. There had been one, Pelham said carefully, that did not. After that, Edmund Reisig had gone quiet in a way that even quiet men remarked on. He still ran the elevator. He still weighed the loads to the pound and kept the scale honest and carried a farmer when a farmer needed carrying. But he came to town Wednesdays to bank and Sundays for nothing at all, and he did not remarry, and he ran that elevator alone for 37 more years, weighing other men's harvests, keeping other men's records, in a country where the wind never fully stopped, and when his hands could not do it anymore, he closed the doors and let it stand. I used to think it was a sad way to live, Pelham said. He turned his coffee cup a half turn on the desk. I'm 80 now, buried my own wife in 11. I don't think it's sad anymore. I think a man finds a thing he can be faithful to, and if the person's gone, the thing's still there, and he holds on to the thing. The wheat came every year whether Marta was here or not. The loads still had to be weighed honest. He looked at Sloane then, and she understood that he had heard about Theo, that they had all heard, that the whole county had handed her around in its quiet way before she ever arrived. You weigh enough honest loads, he said. You find out you're still in the world. That's all. That's the whole of it. She did not answer him. She did not trust herself to. She sat with a man she had met an hour ago in the office of a building she had owned for 3 weeks, and for the second time since the catwalk, she felt the door in its frame come loose, and this time she let it. After Pelham left, she sat alone in the office until the light went out of the milky window, and the propane heater ticked, and the wind did what it always did. And then she got up, and she found the flashlight, and she took the yellow sheet of legal paper out of the desk drawer where she had kept it folded for 3 weeks, and she knelt down in front of the Mosler safe that no living person had ever turned all the way through, and she put her hand on the dial. 38 right. The dial turned under her fingers, gritty and then smooth, the way a thing turns that has not turned in a lifetime. 21 left. The wind pushed at the office wall. 15 right, slow, past the number and back to it, the way Buddy had taught her to find a true line. And under her hand, deep in the iron, she felt the boltwork let go. The door swung open on a hinge that had not moved in a lifetime, and the cold iron smell of the inside came out into the office, and she sat back on her heels and shined the flashlight in and did not touch anything for a long moment, the way you don't touch a thing you have waited for. It was not full. That was the first surprise. She had let herself imagine, against her own better sense, that it would be packed, the way the stories go. It held 4 things, arranged with a care that was itself a kind of message, each one set deliberately and squared to the others. There was a leather ledger, oxblood, the corners gone soft, the spine cracked from 40 years of opening and closing. There was a flat tin box, the kind that had once held lozenges, and when she eased the lid, it held a small bundle of newspaper clippings folded to fit, brown and brittle, the Murdo Coyote, dates running from the 30s to the 80s, every one of them a grain price or a rainfall record or a county note, nothing about himself. There was a brass railroad tag on a loop of wire, a billing tag, stamped with a car number and a route, the kind a station agent would have hung on a loaded grain car bound east, polished by a thumb over many years to a soft gold. And there was an envelope, the paper yellowed, sealed, addressed across the front in a careful upright hand that she recognized before she could have said why, because it was the same hand that had filled the ledger, and on the front it said, "To whoever finds this." She made herself open the ledger first. She was not ready for the letter, and she knew it. The ledger was what she understood, the thing she had been raised toward without knowing it, a record kept the way Theo had kept his and the way she had learned to keep hers, dated and located and free of adjectives. The first entry was 1947. The last was the fall of 1989. In between were 42 years of a man paying attention to one place. Not just the grain, though the grain was all there, the loads and the weights and the dockages and the prices. He had kept the weather. First killing frost every autumn, the date. First wheat heading every spring. The day the meadowlarks came back, every April, in a column of their own, as if he had decided that the return of the meadowlarks was as much a fact worth weighing as a truckload of winter wheat. The depth of the snow. The day the ice went off the Stock Dam. 42 years of it, in a hand that got smaller and more careful as the decades went on, and then, in the last year, began to shake. She read until the flashlight went yellow, and then she put it down, and she picked up the envelope, and she opened it. To whoever finds this, it began, "My name is Edmund Reisig. I was born on this section in 1912, in the sod house my father put up, which is gone now, and I have lived within 3 miles of where you are sitting my whole life. I bought this elevator in 1947 from the bank that took it off a man who could not make it pay through the 30s, and I made it pay, not because I was smarter than him, but because I came up after the worst of it and he came up before. Timing is most of what people call character. I have weighed grain on this scale for 42 years. I have tried to weigh it honest. A scale that lies a little is worse than one that lies a lot, and I will not say more about that because if you are reading this, you have likely already cleaned the knife edges, and you know. I do not have anyone to leave this to. My wife Marta died in 1952, and we had no children that lived, and I will not write more about that either, except to say that a man can be faithful to a place after the person is gone, and that this is not the same as being happy, and it is not nothing. We were married 9 years. It was enough that I never wanted another 9 with anyone else. I have thought about who you might be. You came to an elevator that does not pay anymore, in a county that is losing people every year, on a road that does not go anywhere a person in a hurry would want to go. So you are not in a hurry. Maybe you lost something. Maybe you needed a place that would hold still while you figured out what you are. I do not know. I only know that you turned the dial all the way through, which means somebody trusted you with the numbers, which means you have already started to belong here, whether you have noticed or not. The brass tag is from the last car of grain I shipped in the fall of 1989. I kept it because it was the last. The clippings are the prices and the reins, which is the only history a place like this really has. The ledger is the rest. I am giving it to you not because it is worth money, because it is not, but because 42 years of attention is a thing that should not be thrown out just because the man who paid it is done. Keep your own. Start a new book. Weigh what comes across honest, whether it is grain or anything else. The wheat will come every year whether you are happy or not. That turns out to be a mercy. I did not understand that for a long time. Take care of the scale. It has been telling the truth for longer than either of us. Edmund Reisig, October 1989. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and sat on the floor of the office with her back against the desk and the open safe beside her and the wind doing what it always did, and she cried for the first time since the Tuesday in the break room. Not the careful, contained leaking she had done at the funeral, but the other kind, the kind that empties a person. And the meadowlark column in a dead man's ledger had done what a year and a half of careful handling had not, because a man she had never met had reached 3 generations forward and weighed her honest and told her she had already started to belong. I have held that letter. The County Historical Society has it now, in archival sleeve, in the Jones County collection, and the curator let me read the original with cotton gloves on a Tuesday afternoon, and the hand is exactly as I have described it, upright and careful and shaking only in the last lines. The brass tag is in the same collection. The soft gold of it is from a thumb, years of a thumb, the way metal goes when a man worries it without noticing, in a coat pocket on cold mornings, waiting for the first truck. The rest of that year was work, and the work is most of what saved her, the way it had saved Edmund and the way it had saved Pelham. And I will tell it the way she told it to me, which is in order, because the order mattered to her. She had until the first killing frost to make the elevator able to take grain again, because Buddy Plenkers had wheat coming off in August and no room in the co-op bins in town, which were full from a big year up north, and he had said, not quite asking, that if her elevator could pass the state weights and measures inspection, she could store his crop and charge him the going rate, and that would be money, real money, the first the elevator would earn in 31 years. So there was a clock on it, the good kind, the kind that pulls you forward instead of down. She rebuilt the leg. The leg is the spine of an elevator, the vertical belt of buckets that runs in a tall, narrow shaft called the trunk and lifts the grain from the dump pit at the bottom to the boot at the top of the head house so it can run down by gravity into whatever bin you choose. The belt had perished, gone hard and cracked across, and 3 of the pressed steel buckets had rusted through at the bolt holes where the grain dust holds moisture against the metal year after year. This was the worst job, and she nearly did not finish it. She found a roll of 2-ply rubber elevator belting in Pierre, the right width by luck, and she learned the splice from a diagram and from Buddy and from ruining the first one, the way you stagger and skive and vulcanize cement the overlap so the joint will run 1,000 times a minute over the head pulley without snagging. She bolted on new buckets one at a time, hanging in the dark of the trunk on a knotted rope with a headlamp, the dust she disturbed hanging in the beam, tightening each bolt with a box wrench in a space too narrow to swing it, dropping the wrench twice down 60 feet of shaft and climbing all the way down to fetch it both times because there was no one to drop it to. It took 11 days. When she finally pulled the rope on the old electric motor that drove the head pulley and the belt came up to speed and ran true, the buckets dipping into a test bushel in the boot and carrying it up into the dark and spilling it down the distributor into bin number 3, exactly as it had for 42 years, she sat down on the dump grate and put her face in her hands. And she was not crying, she was just done. And being just done with a hard, true thing is its own clean feeling that the year and a half had not had any of. She rehung the distributor, the swiveling cast iron spout at the top of the head house that aims the falling grain into whichever bin you turn it to, and freed its rusted gear and oiled it. She cleaned the dump pit out by hand and reset the grate where a truck would drive over and dump its load down into the boot. She replaced a section of the spouting, the steel chutes that carry the grain by gravity from one place to another inside the building, where it had rusted thin enough to leak. She read the building like Theo had taught her to read a slope, working out from the parts she understood to the parts she did not, and it gave up its logic to her piece by piece, because a grain elevator, for all its size, is finally a simple and honest machine, a thing for lifting grain up so that gravity can put it where you want it, and an honest scale to measure it by, and a man's word to stand behind the number. That is the whole of it. The genius is in the simplicity. She came to think there was a lesson in that, but she never could say it cleanly, and so she did not try. She had the scale certified. The state inspector drove out from Pierre with his own set of certified test weights in a wooden case and laid them on the platform in a sequence and ran the beam, the small weights and then the heavy ones, checking it light and loaded, and it held true across the whole range. And he signed the certificate and dated it and told her it was the most honest old Fairbanks he'd put a weight on in years, that most of the ones still in service had drifted and nobody had bothered, and he asked who had stoned the knife edges. She said a neighbor had helped her. She did not tell him about Buddy, or about the 12-year-old boy Buddy had been when Edmund first put the stone in his hand, or about the line that had been handed down that section road for the better part of a century, because some things are true and are still not for the certificate. The money went down, and then it turned around. 2,310 had become 980 by July, the belt and the buckets and the galvanized and the inspection fee eating it $100 at a time, and she had begun to do the arithmetic of a person who can see the bottom of the can. And then in August, Buddy's trucks came across the scale, load after load, and she weighed them honest, in and empty out, and wrote the weights in a new ledger she had bought at the drugstore in Murdo, the first entry in a book whose first owner had been dead since before she was born. And the storage checks came, and the number in her head started going the other way for the first time in a year and a half. It is worth saying plainly what this kind of life is and is not, because the internet is full of people selling it as something it is not. There were once tens of thousands of wooden country grain elevators in this country, one every few miles along every rail line on the plains, and there are, by the best count I can find, only a small fraction of them left, and they are coming down a little each year, burned or bulldozed, or simply left until the wind takes them, because they are wood, and they are tall, and they no longer pay. A working one in private hands, weighing real grain, is a rare thing now, and getting rarer. Sloane Merrick did not get rich. She made, that first full year, a little over what she had made in the title office, from storage fees and a small county historical society stipend for the ledger and the clippings, and a state preservation grant tied to the cribbed wall construction, which a survey from the Historical Society in Pierre called one of the best preserved examples in the West River counties. She made enough. Carefully managed, enough is a great deal more than most people understand. The county newspaper, the same Murdo Coyote that had recorded her great-grandfather carrying 11 farmers through the grasshopper years, ran a column about the Reisig elevator going back into service, a few hundred words and a photograph of her standing small at the base of the tower, not facing the camera, looking up at it. And people wrote to her after that, the way people write when something true has been said to them. They wrote from West River and from a long way past it. A man in Ohio wrote that his grandfather had run an elevator in this same county in the 40s, and that he had a photograph of it he would send her. A woman wrote from Oregon that she had grown up 2 towns over and had not been back in 50 years, and had cried at the photograph of the tower because she had not known any of them were left. A retired weights and measures inspector wrote to say that the honest old Fairbanks scales were nearly all gone, and would she consider letting the state document hers? And she said yes. She answered the ones she could. She was careful in the answering, because she had learned from the letter in the safe what a letter from a stranger could do to a person 3 generations down a road they did not yet know they were on. And she did not want to lie to anyone by making it sound easier or cleaner than it was. It was not easy. It was the hardest year of work she had ever done, and she had been broke in the middle of it, and alone for most of it, and frightened more than once. She told them that, the ones who seemed to need the truth more than the comfort. She told them the comfort came after, and only if you stayed. The year turned the way the ledger said it would. The meadowlarks came back in April, and she heard the first one before she saw it, that long, liquid, falling phrase out of the fence line at dawn that she had not known the name of a year before, and now waited for the way you wait for a letter. And she wrote the date in her own book, in the column Edmund had kept, and it was within 4 days of his 40-year average, which is a thing she would not have known to find remarkable a year earlier, and now found nearly unbearable, that the birds and the dead man and her own attention all lined up to within 4 days across 40 years on the same square mile of grass. The wheat headed in May, the heads pushing up out of the boot of the stem all across the eastern fields in the space of about a week, green going to gold over the next month the way it does. She watched a season of grain come up and ripen and come off, start to finish, for the first time in her life, and she understood at last what the elevator was for, why a man would build a thing that tall to serve it. The first hard freeze came in late September and killed the tomatoes she had put in a raised bed behind the office, the leaves blackening overnight, and she wrote that down too, the date, no adjectives. She put up the office for winter, banked the north side, laid in propane and 3 cord of wood, and the canned tomatoes she had got off the vines ahead of the frost. And she was not afraid of the winter the way she had been the first one, because she knew now that the building would not lose its argument with the sky, and that the town would dig her out if the road closed, because the town had decided she belonged, slowly, through work, the only way it decided anything. Pelham came by less often as his hip got worse, but he came and sat in the cracked swivel chair, and once, near the end of that second autumn, he told her she kept the ledger like Edmund had, the same hand almost, the same way of putting down only what was so, and she said she had learned it from her husband, and Pelham nodded and did not ask, and they sat a while, two people who had buried the person they had built their attention around and had found, separately, on the same grass, that the attention outlived the person and could be turned on the world again. Buddy taught her to stone the knife edges herself in the spring before the harvest, the way Edmund had taught him in 19 whatever it was, when his hands were small, and she did it wrong the first time, bearing down where she should have floated the stone, and Buddy said nothing until she had finished, and then he said the one thing, the way Edmund had said the one thing, and she understood that she had been let into something that had been passed hand to hand along that section line for longer than she had been alive, and that her job now was to keep it whole until there was a hand to put it into, whenever that was, whoever that turned out to be. She kept the brass tag on the desk in the office, where she would see it every time she came in at dawn to wait for the first truck, until the day she gave it to the Historical Society, and after that she kept Edmund's letter under glass on the desk in its place. She kept a single thing from the safe that she did not give away, which was nothing of value, a button that had been caught in the spine of the ledger, a small bone button from a woman's dress, and she understood without anyone telling her whose dress it had been, and she carried it in her pocket every day, the way you carry the weight of the people who carried you. She thought about Edmund Reisig more than she had ever thought about anyone she had not met. She thought about a boy born in a sod house on this section in 19 and 12, who had come up through the grasshopper years and the dust years and the war years and had bought a failed elevator off a bank and made it pay, who had married a woman named Marta